Yep.
Oh, okay,
Oh, you know what? Hang on. I've got a little bar. So let me wait until my bar
okay.
reaches the far right. Okay. You can start now.
Great.
Oh, you know what? Hang on. I've got a little bar. So let me wait until my bar
Okay.
reaches the far right.
Good evening, you all. My name is Linda Gorski. I'm the president of the Houston Archaeological Society. I'd like to welcome you to our January 20th, 2022 meeting, our first meeting of the year. And we're so excited to have Louis Aulbach here, who's sitting next to me. And we're going to give you a preview of historical archaeology along Buffalo Bayou. As many of you know, Louis and I have been writing books together since 1998. We've written a series of river guides to the rivers of West Texas, including the Pecos, the Devils, and the Rio Grande. He has written this wonderful book, which I'm going to hold up, called Buffalo Bayou, an echo of Houston's wilderness beginnings, which is a 700, this started out as a 100-page book, and it's a 762-page book about the history of Buffalo Bayou as it developed, of Houston as it developed along Buffalo Bayou from the headwaters in Katy all the way downstream. We are in the process of writing a much shorter book on the 25 most interesting historic and archaeological sites along Buffalo Bayou. And you all are getting a preview of that tonight in our presentation. So, Louis Aulbach.
Oh, well, as Linda said, we've been working on this for over 2 decades. So I hope that shows in some of our presentation here. One of the features that I like to point out is that you can really only do the history of any place when you've been there. And so we've spent quite a bit of time exploring Buffalo Bayou and the historical features. Sometimes we're right down in the bayou almost, as in this left-hand picture. But oftentimes we're in boats, canoes, and in the lower left-hand picture is a tour. It's the Buffalo Bayou Partnership's tour boat. I happen to do the history tours for the partnership. So we have been on the bayou for many times during this 20-year period, and this is where we've identified some of these archaeological ruins.
Now, let me tell you really quickly about this picture up at the upper left. You talk about a cold day. We got a call from Larry Golden, who watches things like the tides. And he said, Gorski and Aulbach, meet me downtown in 30 minutes. No lie. The bayou is at its lowest it's ever been. And I can see the railroad tracks of the old cotton compress.
Exactly.
So we were down there in 30 minutes. And this actually was right near Frosttown, right near the McKee Street Bridge. So we had Doug Boyd on the phone in this ear telling us what measurements to take of this railroad. So you just go to the bayou whenever anybody says, I've seen something interesting. You just drop everything and go.
Even when it's 40 degrees.
Even when it's been cold out there, yep.
Now, we learned some tricks over the last decade with our trips to Rome. You know, Rome is a little older city than Houston, but it has a lot of surprises. And this is a couple of examples of things we've learned. As you walk around the city, keep your eyes open. On the left-hand side here, we were walking by this plot of land, which was right on the Tiber River, but it had a construction fence around it. So we looked at it and said, oh, there's been some work here. We focused on the white panel there that has, as you notice on the lower picture, 3 marble trough basins and a number of little hooks for tying something down. And we wondered, what the heck is that? But it took us about 10 minutes when we got back to the hotel to find out that this was an excavation of a medieval building. But when they went below the building, they ran into the this 1st century BC stable. This was the stable of Marcus Agrippa the number 2 guy in the period of Caesar Augustus. So you just never know what you're going to find when you walk around. And the other example is this big foot that's on a little alleyway in the Campus Martius, and it's sitting there. There's no signage. And so we had to figure out what it was. But again, you go and you can figure it out. And it just from the size of this foot, you calculate the size of the statue. It had to be the cult statue, and the building that is sitting next to happens to be on the actual site of the Temple of Serapis in the Campus Martius. So you have to keep your eyes open, and you'll never know what you'll find. And if you find something strange, that's when you start digging into the history.
So so many of you know that not only have we written about the rivers of West Texas and Buffalo Bayou, but we've also have a series that is up to 6 books now, looking at archaeological sites in Rome, remote archaeological sites in Rome. And so we're using the methodology for writing those books to write our book on Buffalo Bayou. So we thought we'd show you some of the things we see in Rome and go, what the heck? And that's exactly what we've done on Buffalo Bayou.
So we've isolated 24, actually 25. We were out last week and saw something and I said, oh yeah,
25.
We need to add that one. So, but tonight we're gonna pretend we only have 24. They cover a stretch of the bayou from Shepherd Drive over to Lockwood Avenue. It's about a 5-mile stretch, and you can see the numbered sites, most of which are in the downtown core. So we're going to start way upstream at Shepherd Drive, and we're going to look at the infamous, or maybe famous or infamous, however you want to think about it, of Shepherd's Dam. If you haven't heard of Shepherd's Dam, this gentleman here, David P. Shepherd, was a gentleman who arrived in Houston sometime around the Civil War. We're not sure exactly. He first shows up in the city directory in 1866. He was a cousin of Benjamin A. Shepherd. If you're familiar with the general history of Houston, Benjamin Shepherd was a notable banker. But David was one of his cousins. And interestingly enough, he was also the uncle of the future Governor Pat Neff of the state of Texas. So he was well connected. But he himself had fairly routine jobs. He was the superintendent of the telegraph company in the 1860s. And then he was the manager of a flour mill, the Houston flour mill downtown, which is where he may have gotten the idea for building a dam on Buffalo Bayou. The location that he chose for his dam was 4 miles out of downtown. And in 1892, he was promoting this idea of building a dam. And you can see from the upper left picture here, this is during the construction phase of the dam. It's kind of an odd way to build a dam. He took cedar logs and built boxes, and then he filled those boxes with bricks and dirt. And ultimately, he did in fact create the dam. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner. During this period, he was able to build a headwater of about 10 to 12 feet. It backed up the bayou for 3 miles. The county or somebody used this area as a recreational area. This little postcard shows people boating on the backwater of the dam. You can see the bridge that was built by the county in 1895 in the background here. And so the idea that Shepherd had was that you could build flour mills and grist mills and use the water backed up by the dam as a mill race and power these operations with water power instead of electrical power. It's a great idea, but he had some severe miscalculations of the strength of the water in Buffalo Bayou. Now you can be okay. For 10, no, maybe 15 years, every time it rained hard, the dam would get broken and he'd have to repair it. He did this out of his own pocket and eventually went broke trying to repair the dam. The main feature of his idea, though, was that he needed to build a channel or a canal from the Brazos River to bring water into the bayou. He approached the legislature in the late 1890s and they rejected this plan. So his whole idea went down the tubes. He spent almost all of his money attempting to build this dam, and it was a complete failure. By 1912, he had given up, and the newspaper wrote some very uncharitable comments about his shepherd's folly, is what they called it. And so his whole idea was sort of a failure, other than the fact he left his name to the bridge that was built across the bayou at this place. And so we have Shepherd Drive. Now, the reports are that the bridge, the dam was completely lost to visibility by 1930. However, in 2011, 2012, we had a terrible drought in this part of the state. The water level went extremely low. And as you can see, on the left-hand side, we have this brick scatter that appeared in on the banks. And we're pretty certain this came from the dam itself. And on the right-hand side, you can see just the corner of the log log boxes that he was building. We have a close-up down here lower. So this was taken in January of 2012. And very shortly after that, we returned to normal weather patterns, and it has been buried by the silt of the bayou ever since. So maybe in another 50 years, that'll reappear. We did note this location to our contact at the flood control district, and he assured us that before they do any work, they will do the archaeological work on this site. So we're going to move downstream a little ways down to near Glenwood Cemetery, which even in the early 20th century was just at the edge of the city limits. You can see on the little map on the lower left here exactly where it is. It's a large bend in the bayou, and the feature that we're looking at, this monumental outfall, is located right between Memorial Drive and Allen Parkway. And the interesting question is, they built this beautiful outfall to a drainage, but there's no historical signage on this. And I asked the people at the partnership why they haven't put something on there, and I have never gotten an answer. So we're going to tell you the story of this site right now. This is actually a very historic drainage. It was known as Spring Gully. You can see on the wood map of 1869, the drainage goes right down to the bayou. This property was acquired by Phineas Mahan. He was a veteran of the battle of, well, not of the Texas Revolution. He was actually a prisoner of war. They captured him, and he was imprisoned in Matamoros until 1837. But he came to Houston and bought this 55-acre tract and started a farm, which he called Spring Garden, because spring drainage drained the headwater, drained off of the bayou and had a spring at the headquarters. And so he was a moderately successful farmer. He grew fruit trees and vegetables, sold those things in. Now the interesting thing is he died in 1872, and his wife sold the property to a fellow named Abraham Grossbeck. who owned the Houston Brickworks, and he made a brickyard on this site. But Mr. Grossbeck had some financial difficulties, and in the late 19th century, he sold out to his friend William Marsh Rice. Next page here. And so you can see this property, the brickworks ended about 1900, and in 1904, a group of young businessmen decided to form a club called the Houston Golf Club. This was Houston's very first golf course and country club, and it was on the site of Mahan's farm. You can see on this Sanborn map, from 1924, it still shows the location of the golf park. It also is notable that on the lower pass of this creek, that Buffalo Drive was completed. Buffalo Drive was the original name of Allen Parkway. So they're developing the city along this line. And in the 1930s, the city decided to redevelop this property by building the Jefferson Davis Hospital on 13 acres of the site. But they wanted to improve the access to this building. So to do that, they built Gillette Street, and they covered over the gully and made it a storm sewer. So the storm sewer shown in this picture, which is a 1943 picture, the gully is completely gone except for the outfall, which is up in the upper right corner. Oops, let's go back one.
Oh, sorry.
Just one more comment about that. This gully disappeared, and you only had an outfall that was more or less a corrugated pipe up until 2015. The partnership built that monumental outfall, but they have no signage on the story. So you're among the few people in town who knows the story of Spring Gully.
And it'll be in our book.
So we're going to go downstream a little farther, all the way into downtown. In fact, we'll go down to the Franklin Avenue Bridge. In fact, we're going to go under the Franklin Avenue Bridge. And that's where we find this brick wall, red brick wall with a little doorway. We know this is the location of the Donnellan family grave vault. Now, who were the Donnellans? Well, Timothy Donnellan, and he and his wife Emily and their son Henry Donnellan came to Houston about 1839. He was a violinist, but he came to Houston from New Orleans and did fairly well meeting the people in Houston. He served as the alderman in 1843 and 1844. And when he died in 1849, his family built a vault on the banks of the bayou right at the foot of Franklin Avenue. We know that's the case because their son, Henry, was buried in this vault after he was killed in an accident in 1867. And Henry was a Confederate veteran, and every year on Decoration Day, the Veterans Associations would put flowers on the graves of the veterans, and it's written in the paper many times. We put flowers on the grave of Henry Donnellan at the foot of Franklin Avenue, or as in this example that's shown on the bottom, situated near the site of the old Houston and Texas Central Depot. Well, that was just across the bayou from the site. So we know this is the location. In 1900, the city wanted to build the first bridge across the bayou at Franklin Avenue, and they asked the family if they could remove all of the graves. And that's well documented, and they have a nice plot in Glenwood Cemetery. Then they built the bridge and probably extended this area with the doorway across a complete embankment. It goes all the way across the side of the building. Let's go to the next one here. Recently, the partnership has built this new hike and bike trail, which allows you to really get a good picture of this area. And you can see on the left-hand side, we were looking at this about a year ago and realized that there are some arch-type structures on the right-hand side of the little doorway. You can see that the centerpieces are filled with cinder block, but the brickwork is very similar to the brickwork around the little doorway. And it suggests to us that perhaps this was part of the vault structure. We have an interesting photo here from 1905, right after they built the bridge. And you can see within the circle, we have two arch-like structures right at the lower level of the new bridge work at the roadway. So there's more work to be done there. We figure that this would be an archaeological project for the work crew who rebuilds the next bridge over Franklin Avenue. Now we're going to go downstream just a little ways, primarily just to the other side of the Franklin Avenue Bridge. And you can see from this view, the large rectangular concrete structures under the modern bridge. These happen to be the foundations of the Magnolia Brewery building, which is on the left-hand side of this picture. On the right-hand side, we have a picture of this building taken about 1915. The building was constructed in 1912. It's a 3-story building with a basement. And it was the last building built in the Magnolia Brewery complex. It housed a tasting room, some of the executive offices, and so forth. The Magnolia Brewery was the largest brewery in the Southwest during the first decade of the 20th century. But it closed in 1918 due to the passing of the Prohibition Amendment. And the owner, Hugh Hamilton, converted his brewery into a creamery. So instead of making beer, they made ice cream. And that wasn't very successful. And Mr. Hamilton died in 1924. And the estate sold this building to a company that made it into a hotel. Now, I think that the gods of beer must have been a little disappointed in that, and they turned the bayou onto this building. In 1929, in May, Houston recorded its largest flood in its city, in the city's history, and it undermined some of the foundations. It didn't take the building down, but 6 years later, Houston had another large flood, which was even higher in 1935. It washed out the foundations and half of the building collapsed into the bayou. The hike and bike trail, of course, gives us an upfront view of this foundation structure and some of the roadway remains that were still there. This building was in ruins until 1967, but it was purchased by local architect Bart Truxillo, who renovated it and used it as an event center known as the Magnolia Ballroom for many years. It's closed now because Bart passed away just a couple of years ago, but it may reopen. It's interesting to note that during the last decade of this building, that there was a bar in the basement known as the Pink Monkey, and they used the old platform of the roadway, and you can see the brickwork of the old roadway on top of the foundation as their outdoor patio bar. Some things along the bayou never go away. They just keep leaving them there. We'll move down about 100 yards to this bridge here, which is the Milam Street Bridge. This is a modern bridge, of course, and not the focus of the main story, but the Milam Street Bridge was actually the very first bridge built by the city over Buffalo Bayou in October of 1838. But the real story of the Milam Street Bridge occurred in 1865 after the defeat of the Confederacy. And in July, the Union forces were coming to occupy Houston. Well, a merchant named John Kennedy had a building on Travis Street near Market Square, and he had leased that building to the Confederacy as an arsenal. So he had a building full of cannonballs, all sorts of supplies, military supplies, and so forth. And he certainly didn't want to have that in his building when the Union troops showed up. So he had all of his workmen dump that stuff in the bayou right off of the Milam Street Bridge. And for 100 years thereafter, every time we had a low water event on the bayou, Houstonians would pick artifacts out of the bayou. One of the Houstonians that picked up an artifact, namely a cannonball, was Henry Donnellan. That's what blew up and killed him, and he ended up in the family vault. But a lot of artifacts were in the bayou. When they built a new bridge across here in 1924, they found artifacts. And when they built this bridge, which was built in 1947, the construction company pulled out 351 cannonballs, which were sent to Fort Sam Houston to be disposed of. 20 years later, a local, we'll call him a treasure hunter, but I think he was
Salvage.
a salvage person, yeah. A fellow named Carroll Lewis. He had an organization that he called the Southwestern, let me see what's the name.
Salvage company.
Salvation Exploration Salvage Company or something of that. Anyway, they brought a clamshell excavator down to the bridge. And one day in June, they started excavating on the bridge, off the bridge. And for 6.5 hours, they didn't find anything. And so Carroll Lewis said, why don't we move this thing into the center of the bridge and excavate? And the first clamshell excavation brought up a 3-inch Parrott projectile, a Civil War munitions item, and they knew they were in the right place. And for the rest of the day, they continued to pull out artifacts from the Civil War. The artifacts were then put on display at the Museum of Natural Science in 1974. And after that exhibition, they disappeared for 30 years. In 2015, I believe it was, Linda was down at the Heritage Society, and the curator, Ginger Burney, told her that she had 13 or so boxes labeled Buffalo Bayou, and she had no idea what they were from. Linda called me, and I said, well, send me the documents that you have with it. And when I looked at them, they were the transfer documents from the Museum of Natural Science to the Heritage Society. We offered to catalog, analyze, and even conserve these documents. And so after numerous labs at Linda's house, working on the boxes of materials, you can see there's Charlie Gordy on the left-hand side analyzing the cannonball and some musket balls down below. And of course, Linda is extremely good at analyzing rusty nails, and she has them well organized. But better than that, we happen to have within our organization a candidate for a PhD at Texas A&M in
Nautical archaeology.
nautical archaeology. And he was looking for a dissertation topic, and he proposed to his advisor a project to conserve these Confederate munitions. And after 2 years, he brought these back to the Heritage Society, and they were placed in an exhibition at the Heritage Society known as the Dumped and Forgotten Below the Milam Street Bridge. And you can see the display of not only the cannonballs and musket balls, but various items from the artifacts that were retrieved.
And I will say that THC was right behind this project the whole time. And in fact, Amy Borgens came down before we started anything and gave the site a trinomial.
Right.
And
so this is a classic example of just by accident, we happened to know the story and the artifacts found us, and we were able to put a good ending to this long historical story of Houston.
and that's when we found out that Charlie Gordy is an expert on horseshoes, munitions, and parrot cannons. It was very exciting.
So we'll go down a little farther, about 2 more blocks downstream, to what is known, or what was, in fact, the Port of Houston from 1837 until 1914. Most of the buildings along Commerce Avenue, which is the first street up above the wharf area, were related to the industry, the shipping industry. And if you look at the lower right-hand picture, you get a nice picture of the port in 1913. And the building that's highlighted in the lower picture was actually the International Coffee Company building. It's one of the few buildings that still date from this early period of the Port of Houston. It has been renovated, and that's the picture on the left here. What they had to do was remove all the bricks because they were contaminated with asbestos, but they renovated it and restored it to its original condition. It happens to be the offices of the Buffalo Bayou Partnership today.
Do you remember slide on this?
I think I do. This building,
There it
go
is.
back.
Okay. Surprise.
The International Coffee Company went out of business in 1930, and the building, which you see on the upper right, was a warehouse for up until 1967. Now we can go to the next slide. In 1967, the city attempted to revitalize the downtown district with musical venues, restaurants, bars, and so forth. And so the local artist here, David Addix, he's a well-renowned artist from this part of the country. He leased the 3rd floor of this building as the Love Street Light Circus and Feel Good Machine. It was a psychedelic music venue. He papered it with his iconic poster of Theda Barrett there, and it was quite a place. It hosted many popular musicians, the most notable being Billy Gibbons, who performed there with his group called Moving Sidewalks. 2 of his partners in that band were drafted in 1968, so he had to reform his group, and he renamed it ZZ Top, and of course the rest is history. We don't know of many other big name stars who played there, except I came across this photo here just recently, and as you can see on the billboard, so to speak, there, that both there were 2 performers, Flatt and Scruggs, very prominent bluegrass performers, and a local star, Lightning Hopkins, were both performing that day. Now, I must admit, I do not know the Garden of Joy Jug Band, but I assume they were pretty good too.
But you know, we are so lucky because we knew David Addix from another project we'd done, and he invited us to our warehouse, and we got to see his warehouse down on Silver Street. Yeah, and he was able to show us all his posters that he did. But additionally, a couple of years earlier, we met him and the painter, the people who painted the psychedelic wording on the side of the building before it ever became the Buffalo Bayou Partnership.
Right.
And in the hallway of that building was where all these musicians had signed their names on in the alcove. It was unbelievable, very cool.
Right. So we're going to go a little farther downstream, maybe 2 blocks. And when you look out over the bayou, you see this wharf area, these pilings for a wharf, which have been there for a long time. They're probably dating to the late 19th century and certainly the early 20th century. We took this picture actually just last week because we went out earlier to take a picture and the water had risen to 18 feet and it was almost underwater. So a week later, we were able to get a full view of this wharf structure. This is on the north bank, opposite Austin Street, if you're familiar with that. And what's interesting is the nice green grass that's on the lower part of this picture is part of the new hike and bike trail and a little pocket park that's going in. So we're able to get a good photo. You can see from these the Sanborn map in 1896, the Direct Navigation Company owned the property on the north side of the bayou, and the Direct Navigation Company was the predecessor to the Port of Houston Authority. So they used the North Bank as an auxiliary expansion to the Port of Houston. The little photo on, or the map on the right-hand side from 1907 shows the expansion of that wharf area, and you can see it says it's a cotton platform. They had to expand the wharf area in the city to enhance the ability to move the major product out of this area, which was cotton. This was a period when cotton was king. Needless to say, that passed away as soon as the Port of Houston was moved to the turning basin, and all the cotton business went that way. But one of the rules of thumb is that if it's on the banks of the bayou, and you can just leave it there because nobody will notice it. And speaking of noticing it, we're going to go a little farther downstream where there was located this large building, which is known or was known as the Gabel Street Power Plant. This was an electrical generating power plant built in 1900, and it supplied all of the power, electrical power for the city of Houston until 1924. By 1924, though, they were generating so much electricity and they had to dissipate the heat in the turbines by pumping water out of the bayou through the turbines, through the cooling towers, and back into the bayou. By 1924, they realized what they were really doing was not cooling the turbines, they were raising the water temperature of the bayou. So the electric company, which by then was known as HL&P, Houston Lighting and Power, they built a new plant down in Pasadena, appropriately named the Deepwater Plant, and they made this a subsidiary plant. What's left on the banks of this building was destroyed actually, or demolished in 2011, so it's not there today. But what does remain are the cooling pipes. We'll go to the next one. This is a picture that we actually took last week, and you can see these enormous pipes are just standing on the banks of the bayou. They've been there for 75 years or so. Now, we did notice one other feature while we were taking a picture, and right in the center above the pipes, you'll see a mass of brick and concrete, and it occurred to us that that might be remnants of the previous power plant that exploded before they built the Gable Street plant. So that's another future archaeological study to go on. The next site is just around the corner from the pipes there, and you can see on the upper left concrete debris lying on the banks of the bayou. These are the remains of the Crystal Ice Works factory that was located in this area from about 1880 to 1932. The Crystal Ice Works, as identified in the lower left picture, was a substantial manufacturing plant associated with the rail yard that was adjacent to it, which was the Texas and New Orleans Railroad, which was owned by the Southern Pacific. In 1906, the Southern Pacific Railroad started a service known as the Pacific Fruit Express, and they brought fruits and vegetables from California all the way to the East Coast along the route, the southern route of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Well, this was prior to refrigerated rail cars, so they needed ice to put into the rail cars to keep the fruits and vegetables cool. And that was the reason for the Crystal Ice Works. Refrigerated cars came into being in the early 30s, and the ice works went out of business. Now, Hurricane Harvey in 2017 hit this side of the bayou pretty hard, and you can see all of the debris that was exposed. We went down there right after the storm subsided and found a cistern in this area, as well as a pavement that was probably associated with a dock area. And subsequently, the silt has rebuilt and covered those ruins, and they're not there today. But eventually, there may be a project to excavate that as well. A little farther downstream, we come to probably the most recognizable site in the industrial eastern side of the bayou and downtown. People ask me, well, what are these old fortifications? And unfortunately, I have to explain to them that they're not fortifications, and they're not really very old, but they are very prominent. The picture on the left is the view from the front side, and you can see there 4 tall cylinders that were gravel silos for the Houston Shell and Concrete Company. The picture on the right, the upper right, shows that actually there was an earlier building phase to this, and they have these older gravel bins that were used by the concrete company before they realized they needed more capacity, and they built the silos. This was an excellent example of post-World War II construction materials site, and then it has subsequently moved farther east on the bayou. But it's an interesting site that was purchased by the Buffalo Bayou Partnership as a little pocket park. So it sits right on the hike and bike trail and gets a lot of attention, and sometimes a lot of graffiti, as you can see from the left-hand picture. They've had to paint it over.
When Lewis and I first went down here, this was out. I mean, there was nothing around it. It was just out by itself. And now there are beautiful homes.
$500,000 townhomes are
right
being
up
built
against,
right next to it.
Yeah, right next to it. So
it used to be a pretty barren spot, but now it's becoming an upscale residential community. And we're going to go one more step downstream all the way almost to North York Street, where the Tony Marron Park is. And 3 blocks off the river is this extraordinary monument that is stuck in the overgrowth of the brush along the roadway. It's a monument that was part of the safety program of the Trinity Portland Cement Company, a program that began in 1923. And if you read the inscription on the bottom, this plant in Houston was awarded this trophy in 1929. So it dates fairly far back in the history of the construction industry in Houston. There's an interesting story about this monument. The Trinity Portland people put out a call for submissions of models for this monument, and the monument was the award that they accepted as the model was presented by a group from the Art Institute of Chicago under the director of the sculpture division, a fellow named Alvin Palachek. And he had his students propose different designs, and this design was designed and sculpted by one of his students, a lady named Ruth Sherwood. She built this, or sculpted this neoclassical design with two figures. The male figure is most likely representative of the worker, but the background figure is obviously the goddess Athena. You can tell from the headdress, and she holds an oil lamp, which is very symbolic of wisdom, which is one of the attributes of Athena. So it's a quite stylish monument. By the way, it's very sizable. It's about 8 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and about 18 inches deep. Reportedly, it weighs 6 tons. So once it's installed, it stays fairly permanent for a while. There's an interesting story that goes with it. If we go to the next slide, this is Ruth Sherwood, and with her model that she had proposed. And we have Mr. Polasek here on the right-hand side. He was fairly impressed with his student. In fact, he hired her as his secretary, and she served as his secretary for 25 years. But in 1945, she developed throat cancer and decided to move back to Winter Park, Florida, where she came from. Well, Mr. Polasek built her a home in Winter Park, and then he retired a couple years later and moved there as well. They were married in 1945, no, take it back, 1950, and she died a year later. She was buried in the cemetery plot that he had purchased. He remarried a few years later, and when he died, he was buried next to her, and his second wife, when she died 20 years later, was buried next to him. So it's not only is it an enduring monument to safety, we have a love story of enduring love in this thing as well. Now, one more slide. These were very popular monuments. I did a quick Google search, and I came up with 16 of them that are still out there. Many of them are just like the monument here in Houston. They've been abandoned, but they can't get rid of them. They're big and heavy. So some of them are put in parks and so forth.
Well, but one more comment about this. When Louis and I first discovered this, it's like discovering the stuff in Rome. We're walking along the bayou and we look to our right, and inside the trees, I mean, it was absolutely covered with overbrush. So you just have to keep your eyes open and look.
And so we're going to give you these 10. There are 14 or 15 more, and we encourage you to take advantage of the hike and bike trail. And when we have our guide out, you can follow it along all of these little sites, and it'll be an interesting study of history at the level of the bayou, so to speak.
So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions?
Everyone's still muted, I see, but there was just several comments, but there was one question that came in from a couple of people. when you actually publish your updated book, your book on this thing, how about if we organise a bio boat private tour for HAS?
Oh, well.
Excellent
We could do that.
idea.
A
Excellent.
guided boat trip.
Oh,
Well,
that'd be
that
fun.
would
That'd be
work.
great.
Maybe put that one on the slate.
Okay.
We can do that. We actually, one of
But
the,
I don't see any more questions in the chat unless anyone else has got anything. Any more questions? If you've got them, put them in the chat.
Well, a lot of people are chatting, but they're not asking questions. So
Yeah,
that's great.
No, that's no.
Anyway, the name of our book is going to be the Houston
Buffalo
Bayou
Greenway.
Greenway. We already have a cover, and
Somebody's asking when it'll be published, hopefully by the summer,
yeah. When did you start looking into the Bayou's history? Oh my gosh.
about 2000, I think. It's like anything, you have to continually search it and look at it. And like I say, even last week when we were out, we found something we hadn't seen before. So
What about the old Velasco Street incinerator plant?
we were going to put this in, Doug, but Linda said, no, don't put that
Oh,
one.
he lies so bad.
It's going to be in the book. Hey, we had to leave it to 10 sites.
But thanks for asking that. I love trash. We did go by, we did take some really good pictures of the Willow Street pump station the other day. So that'll be in the book too. So.
Yeah, so you're way ahead of the game, Doug.
There's always an awkward one, isn't there? And you're it, Doug.
So, let me tell you, walking along the bayou and finding what's out there is one of the most interesting things you can do. It's like a treasure hunt.
Right.
And with the little book, you'll know exactly what the treasure is when you see it.
And I wish I knew how to do this, but one of the
Was
things.
Spring Gully an old slave? No, I doubt it was, because it was not a feature that would, present itself for that. It was just a drainage ditch along the banks of the bayou.
One of the things we discovered the other day, which I wish I could put a picture up, it was a manhole cover at Allen's Landing at the foot of Travis Street. And this manhole cover said, "The City of Pearland." Why the heck is that there? I mean, you just find so many curious things along the bayou.